Welcome, everybody. It is day 3 of IBTM Wired. Can you believe it? We're kind of at the halfway mark of our brilliant program. And this is day 3, the Middle East and Africa. I don't know how many of you have been attending our sessions so far, part of that knowledge program, the education sessions that came first from Singapore on day 1, and then we had Americas yesterday, and today our focus on the region of the Middle East and Africa. I'm Miriam Staley. I'm delighted to be hosting some of these sessions again for you today, and we have got a brilliant agenda lined up. I'm so excited about the program that's coming up today. Now, as always, I do say we can't see your faces, we can't necessarily engage in person, but it doesn't mean that we can't have that conversation together, maybe using social media platforms like Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn. Just use that hashtag IBTM Wired, because it's great to hear your thoughts, your insights, what's resonating with you as our speakers come on stage and share their insights and learnings with you all. So I did say we have a jam-packed agenda, and I don't want to take up any more of his time because we have the most amazing keynote speaker lined up for you, who is going to take the stage this morning with his session on Moonshot thinking. Now, this is all going to be about imagining the unimaginable and solving the unsolvable, coming up with those amazing, creative, different solutions that can help us all to drive our businesses forward to achieve even more success. Our speaker this morning has quite an incredible backstory. He's literally a rocket scientist, so he's going to make rocket science a bit simple for us, but he's a native of Turkey, in Istanbul in Turkey. He was a non-English speaker from a family of people who didn't speak the language, and yet he learned it himself. He moved to the United States at the age of 17, all by himself, attended Cornell University to major in astrophysics, and is now one of the preeminent speakers on innovation, on creativity, on critical thinking. Yes, I did say he's a rocket scientist, turned obviously speaker and author and lawyer and professor. This man has quite the CV, and I'm sure that his insights are going to wow us all today. I'm going to let him tell more of his story, but just to give you a little indication of how much he's been involved with these moonshot processes. He was involved in the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers project. I mean, my goodness, what he has to share with us today is going to be very, very exciting indeed. I'm delighted to welcome to the virtual stage with me this morning, Mr. Ozan Varol, who is going to share his thinking on moonshot processes and how we can all apply those to our own lives and businesses. Ozan, welcome to stage. Come and join me. It's really great to have you with us this morning. I'm going to hand over to you, and I'll see you for the Q&A later.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Miriam. Gonna share my screen real quick and we'll get going. Okay. In September 1962, President John F. Kennedy stepped up to a podium at Rice University Stadium and pledged to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Now, at the time, this pledge was quite literally a moonshot, because so much of what would be required to land on the moon just hadn't been done yet. No American astronaut had been outside of a spacecraft in space. 2 spacecraft had never docked together in space. NASA didn't know if the surface of the moon was solid enough to support a lander. They didn't know if the communication system would work on the moon. Kennedy said some of the metals required to build the rockets haven't even been invented. Given that reality, in just less than 7 years after Kennedy's pledge, Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. And just to set the accomplishment in context, a child who was just 6 years old when the Wright brothers took their first flight, which lasted about 10 seconds, that child, that 6-year-old, would be 72 when Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. And that huge leap from Wright brothers to Neil Armstrong in just 66 years, that's a single human lifespan that we're talking about here. That's often celebrated as the triumph of technology. But it wasn't. It was a triumph of a certain thought process that rocket scientists used to turn the seemingly impossible into the possible. And I wrote a book about that thought process. It's called Think Like a Rocket Scientist. It's been now translated into about 25 languages. So you might be able to find it in your country, in your own native language. But I'm going to share with you some insights from the book. And specifically, I'm going to walk you through this moonshot process that I cover in the book in terms of achieving your moonshots. And I'm going to talk more about what moonshot thinking means in just a moment. But my goal is to give you actionable strategies by the end of the talk that you can use to see opportunities to do things differently. And that might be opportunities for growth, for designing meetings differently that you may not have been able to see before, future-proof your business from rapidly changing trends and technologies, and just give yourself an extraordinary advantage to define the future of your industry. And I'm going to start with the reimagine step. Probably going to spend the most amount of time here because this is one of the hardest things to do, is to make change happen, to reimagine how things work. Now, what gets in the way of reimagination? And I'm going to say a few words about that. And in most places, it tends to be two mindsets. The first mindset, and I'm sure you've heard this before, we've always done it this way. Right? We've always done it this way. We've always run our business this way. We've always designed meetings this way. So we're going to keep doing it that way. And everybody else, that's the second mindset, is everyone else is doing it this way. So we're just going to keep doing what they're doing and stay the course. And we are in many ways genetically programmed to follow the herd. Thousands of years ago, conformity to our tribe was essential to our survival. If you didn't conform, if you didn't do what other people told you to do, you would get rejected, or worse, left for dead. But in the modern world, conformity can be a curse rather than a blessing. When we conform, we copy what our competitors are doing. We look at the rearview mirror and just do what we did yesterday. Businesses plant the lightning rod where lightning struck last. This worked before, so let's do it again and again and again. Let's run the same marketing campaign. Let's write another book about romance between teenage vampires. Let's make the 17th sequel to the Fast and Furious movies. Now, this can work in the short term, but it's a recipe for long-term disaster. Because over time, imitation makes the trend obsolete. A young and scrappy business willing to reimagine how things work ends up speeding past everyone to the finish line. Now, if you were a horse breeder in the early 1900s, you would have assumed that your competition was other breeders breeding faster and stronger horses, not cars. If you ran a taxi company 10 years ago, you would have assumed that your competition is other taxi companies, not Uber and Lyft. In each case, the past drowns out the future. Kodak is a great example of this. The company actually had the early patents to digital cameras, but the top management didn't believe that digital film would completely replace physical film. They were too busy just looking at what made the company successful in the past. And you can add Borders, BlackBerry, Blockbuster, and numerous other companies to this list. In each case, the unsinkable sinks, the uncrashable crashes, the indestructible self-destructs, because we assume that what made them successful in the past secures their future. Now, technology doesn't explain these failures. It's more about the leader's failure to reimagine the future as technology develops around them, as the world changes around them. So how do you make sure that this doesn't happen to your business? How do you make sure it doesn't happen to your job? How do you stay at the forefront of change instead of being unraveled by it? Well, one of the keys to doing this is moonshot thinking. And moonshot thinking is the kind of thinking that inspired President Kennedy to promise to land on the moon when the metals required to build the rockets hadn't even been invented. Now, that was our first actual moonshot, but humans have been taking metaphorical moonshots long before Neil Armstrong walked on the lunar surface. The discoverers of the fire, the inventors of the wheel, the builders of pyramids, the makers of cars, they were taking moonshots. It was a moonshot for slaves to reach for freedom, for women to take the ballot, for refugees to push toward distant shores in search of a better life. We are a species of moonshots, even though we've largely forgotten it. We've been seduced into believing that flying lower is safer than flying higher, and that coasting is better than soaring. But altitude, as any pilot will tell you, is your friend. Because if your engine quits high when you're flying high, you've got options for gliding your plane to safety. But at low altitudes, the possibilities in flight, just like the possibilities in life, tend to be more limited. And research shows that businesses that fly at higher altitudes, that implement moonshot thinking, tend to perform better. And that's for a number of reasons. Moonshots appeal to human nature. They attract investors. They attract customers. Customers are now drawn to companies that are doing remarkable things. Moonshots are also talent magnets. One of the great examples here is SpaceX. SpaceX is Elon Musk's space company. Achieved incredible success. It became the first private company to take humans into Earth orbit. Only US, China, and Russia have been able to do that in the past, and SpaceX beat everybody else, including the established industry players, to the finish line. What was their secret? Now, one of their secrets was that they've been able to pick the best rocket scientists in the world and make them work around the clock on audacious projects. And they often pick rocket scientists from traditional aerospace companies and got them to come to SpaceX. And their promise to them was simple. They would go to these rocket scientists and they would say, look, if you come to SpaceX, you don't have to sit in endless meetings. You don't have to deal with bureaucratic red tape. If you come to our company, you will get to do what you were trained to do, which is to build rockets. And one day, in the not too distant future, the rockets that you build are going to take people to Mars. Now, that's a promise that most rocket scientists can't refuse. Moonshots also force you to reimagine the status quo. So if your goal is to just improve a little bit, it's just 1% improvement, you can stay within the status quo. But if your goal is to improve, say, tenfold, then the status quo has to go. Pursuing a moonshot often puts you in a different league, playing a different game than your competitors, so the established plays and routines just become irrelevant. So here's a good example of this. If your goal is to improve car safety, you can make gradual improvements to the design of a car to better protect human life in the case of an accident. But if your goal is a moonshot of eliminating all accidents, then you have to question all assumptions and begin with a blank slate. And one of the fundamental assumptions you have to question, if that is your moonshot, is the human operator behind the wheel. So that type of thinking paves the way for the possibility of self-driving vehicles. Now, some moonshots are not going to work. So it's important to balance your portfolio of ideas so you're not betting your company's future or your future on a single moonshot. As long as your portfolio of ideas is balanced, as long as you're doing what you were doing before, but experimenting, and I'm going to say more about experimenting in just a little bit here. Experimenting with a few moonshots, placing small bets, one success is going to compensate in spades for the ideas that don't work. Now, moonshot thinking doesn't mean, thinking happy thoughts and crossing your fingers that they become reality. A moonshot without a plan is just a fantasy. So we need idealism combined with pragmatism. And that's where a little known strategy called backcasting comes into play. And when we plan for the future, most businesses engage in forecasting, right? We look at our current customers, current services, current budget, and we just extrapolate them, we project them into the future. We ask ourselves, well, what can we do given what we have? But often what we have, the status quo, is part of the problem. And forecasting takes all of those problematic biases and assumptions embedded into what we're doing and just propels them into the future. Backcasting flips the script. So with backcasting, instead of starting with your present reality, you begin with an ideal reality in the future. So this is like going back. It's like the movie Back to the Future, right? You go to the future and you're coming back from the future. So if you're NASA, If you're John F. Kennedy, you're saying, we're going to begin with Neil Armstrong on the moon. That is the ideal reality, and work backward from that to determine exactly what we need to do, a step-by-step roadmap to determine exactly what we need to do to get there. So when we forecast the future, we try to predict what's going to happen, and often those predictions turn out to be completely wrong because the world is changing so fast. But when we backcast the future, we create it because we begin with the ideal goal in mind and work backward from it. My life story, as Miriam explained, has been, this is a photo of me from when I was a kid. It's really what brought me here to this moment was a result of moonshot thinking and backcasting. As Miriam mentioned, I grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, in a family of no English speakers. When I was growing up, we'd get these blackouts quite frequently. So we'd lose power at night. And when I was really little, these would terrify me. So my dad came up with a game. We would light a bunch of candles. He'd grab my soccer ball and he would rotate the soccer ball around the candle to show me how the Earth rotated around the sun. And those were my first astronomy lessons, and I was hooked. My moonshot becoming an astronaut one day. And I wasn't calling it backcasting at the time, but I remember in middle school, shortly after we got internet at my school, I sat down to research the biography of every single astronaut that had ever worked at NASA to try to figure out exactly what they did to get to where they were. So I began with that ideal reality and worked backward from that to determine exactly what I needed to do to get there. And I went from daydreaming about space in Turkey to having front row seats to the action when I ended up working on the operations team for the Mars Exploration Rovers project back in 2003. If I wasn't aiming high and if I hadn't applied backcasting to sketch out a roadmap to getting to that moonshot, I wouldn't be standing before you today. So think about it. What is your moonshot? I know there are a lot of event planners and meeting planners in the audience today. What is your moonshot? If your moonshot, say, is an audience member walking out of one of your events completely delighted with what just happened, so delighted that they cannot stop talking about the event to everyone they know. If let's say that's your ideal reality, how do you work backward from that? Let your brain run wild. Set aside constraints and limitations for the time being and explore, create a roadmap for how you might be able to make that moonshot a reality. And once you create the roadmap, then you can start actually working on it. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about first principles thinking. So far, we've defined your moonshot. We use backcasting to sketch out a roadmap to get to that moonshot. The next step in the process is to use first principles thinking to eliminate assumptions. And I'm going to go back to SpaceX here. This is Elon Musk. As I mentioned, his moonshot is sending humans to Mars one day. When he was first thinking about starting SpaceX and sending people to Mars, he started shopping to buy rockets. He first looked on the American market, and on the American market, rockets were way too expensive. He then went to Russia to shop for decommissioned intercontinental ballistic missiles that he could repurpose as rockets, and even those were way too expensive for him. He was about to give up when one day he had an epiphany, and he realized that his approach had been flawed all along. In trying to buy rockets that other people had built, he realized that he was not reasoning from first principles. So reasoning from first principles is a way of letting go of everything except for what is essential. So you are eliminating assumptions embedded into whatever product, service, or business you might be in until you're left with the fundamental subcomponents. So what does that mean exactly for SpaceX, for example? And then I'll talk about how this might apply in other industries as well. For Elon Musk, applying first principles meant stepping back and asking himself, well, wait a minute, what does it take to actually send a rocket into space? Like, what are the fundamental subcomponents of a rocket? And it turns out that if you buy those subcomponents, those raw materials on the market, and just build the rocket yourself from scratch, it would be 2% of the price of a used rocket. So that's what he decided to do. And he decided, this is a photo of one of SpaceX's factories. If you go through one of these factories, you'll find people doing everything from welding titanium to building in-flight computers. First principles thinking prompted SpaceX to question another deeply, deeply held assumption in rocket science. And that assumption was that rockets could not be reused. So for decades, rockets, once they delivered their cargo into orbit, they would burn up in the atmosphere or plunge into the ocean, requiring an entirely new rocket to be rebuilt. Now imagine for a moment doing that for airplanes, right? I'm currently in Portland, Oregon. I fly, say, to London. All the passengers leave the plane. Somebody steps up to the plane and just lights it on fire. Sounds ridiculous, but that's what we did for rockets for decades. And the price of a modern, like Boeing 737, isn't that much less than a rocket, but commercial air flight is so much less expensive than space flight because airplanes, unlike rockets, can be reused over and over and over again. Well, SpaceX is on its way to changing that. You're looking here at a photograph of 2 rockets from the Falcon Heavy vehicle landing back on solid ground after they delivered their cargo to orbit. So these rockets are now being refurbished and reused over and over again. And these innovations are on their way to cutting the cost of space flight by a factor of 40. That's 40. Then there are so many examples of this outside of rocket science as well. You know, we used to assume that you needed bank loans and venture capital funding to be able to launch a new product or a new business. Questioning those assumptions gave us Kickstarter. We used to assume that you needed a physical store and late fees to be able to rent videos. Questioning those assumptions gave us Netflix. So this is a question I ask myself from time to time, and I encourage you to ask it as well. Do we own our assumptions, or do our assumptions own us? What do you assume you're supposed to do simply because you've done it before? What do you assume you're supposed to do simply because other people around you are doing it? Can you question that assumption and replace it with something better? There's a quote I love from the actor Alan Alda. He says, "Your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while, or the light won't come in." It's often through eliminating the assumptions that are cluttering our thinking that we're able to reimagine what's possible. I'm going to share with you one final tactic here on Reimagine, and then we're going to move to the next portion. Another powerful way to reimagine the status quo and eliminate assumptions is to reframe the problem that you're facing. We tend to assume that breakthrough ideas begin with a smart answer, but they often begin with a smart question. So here's an example. This is an actual exercise that a professor at Stanford Business School runs in a class in entrepreneurship. She walks into the room, she divides the class into different teams, and she gives each team $5 in funding. And she says, you've got $5, your goal, your mission is to make as much money as possible in 2 hours, and then you give a 3-minute presentation to the class. All right, so this is the setup. This is an actual exercise. Make as much money as possible in 2 hours and give a 3-minute presentation to the class. Now, typical answers include things like many students go and buy materials to wash cars. So they'll buy soap and detergent and everything else they need to wash cars, and they'll start doing that. Some students set up a lemonade stand. So they make lemonade with the $5. They buy materials for that and they sell lemonade. Those teams don't do very well. The teams that make the most amount of money don't use the $5 at all. They realize that the $5 is a distracting resource for them because it's not very much. So they ignore it. Instead, they go back to first principles and they start from scratch. They frame the problem more broadly as, how do we make the most amount of money if we start with absolutely nothing? One particularly successful team ended up making reservations at popular restaurants in Silicon Valley, where Stanford is located. and then selling those reservation times to wealthy executives who wanted to skip the wait. And that team made about, I think, $300 in just 2 hours by just selling these reservation times to rich executives. But the team that came in first place, the team that did the best, realized that both the $5 and the 2 hours were not the most valuable resource in their arsenal. Rather, the most valuable resource in their arsenal was this 3-minute presentation time they had in front of a captivated Stanford class. As you can imagine, Stanford is one of the most well-known universities in the United States. A lot of businesses want to attract Stanford students to come work for them. So what this team did was they sold that 3-minute presentation slot to a company that was interested in recruiting Stanford students, and they walked away with $650. Now, I love that example, that story, and what the team that came in first place did, because it illustrates the difference between tactics and strategy. We often use these terms interchangeably, but they refer to very different things. A strategy is your plan for achieving an objective. The tactics are the tools you use, the actions you take. That $5 bill, that's a tactic to achieve the overall strategy. The Stanford students that didn't do very well in the $5 challenge, they fixated on the tactic. They fixated on the $5, and they lost sight of the overall strategy. But just because a $5 bill is sitting in front of you doesn't mean that it's the most valuable tool or it's the most effective tool for the job. It's like that saying, if you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. When we're blinded by the tools that are sitting in front of us, what we've done in the past, it becomes harder to zoom out and see the bigger picture. So ask yourself, what's the $5 tactic in your life? How do you ignore it and find the 2-hour window, like the students that made the popular reservations that did in the Stanford case? Or even better, how do you ignore everything and find the most valuable 3 minutes in your arsenal? The goal here is to move away from the what to the why. So frame the problem more broadly, not in terms of tactics, but tactics are also important, but you first need to identify the strategy. So asking yourself, well, what is this tactic for? What is this $5 bill for? And once you keep the strategy in mind and you zoom out from tactics that you've been using in the past, you'll be able to see other tactics and often better tactics that are lurking in plain sight. Okay, so the goal is to emerge out of the Reimagine stage with a clearly defined moonshot, reimagined ideas, and some thoughts on how you might be able to get there. The next step is to take those ideas and to start experimenting. Now, when we're moving from reimagining to experimenting, when we actually start trying things, there's going to be enormous uncertainty involved. We don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And uncertainty is terrifying to most people. That's in part a relic of our education system. Our education system, I think, regardless of what country you're in, tends to create a false perception of certainty, right? When you're in school, you memorize all of these right answers that other people have figured out, and it gives you the false impression that everything is certain. Everything has been determined already by someone far smarter than you. And your job is to just memorize them and then spit them back out on a standardized test. But that's not how the real world works. The real world is filled with uncertainty. And if you look at the history of science, and this is true regardless of what industry you're in, all breakthroughs happen in uncertain conditions. The discovery of X-rays, DNA, penicillin, oxygen, they all happen when scientists embraced rather than rejected uncertainty. Certainty isn't interesting. Certainty means that the answers have been figured out already. It's only in conditions of uncertainty, when we don't know, that breakthroughs happen. We're so afraid of uncertainty that rather than taking a leap, we cling to the safe bet. We do the same thing year after year, only just making little improvements here and there. And as a result, we pass up opportunities to level up. If you stick to the unfamiliar, you won't find the unexpected. I'm going to give you one tool that I use often Rocket scientists use this tool as well as a way of reducing the fear of uncertainty. Now, we often, in conditions of uncertainty, we often don't act because we assume that if we try something new, if we say, design a different type of meeting, if we take a new job, if we try a new, if we move to a new city and things don't work out as we hoped, life as we know it is going to come to an end, right? That we assume that that's what's going to happen, the worst case scenario. But that assumption is flawed in many cases. Most of our decisions come with two-way doors, not one-way doors. So two-way door meaning you can walk inside of a new room, and if you don't like what you see, you can always walk back out. So many of the decisions that we make in life are reversible. You can go back to what you were doing. This was the approach that Richard Branson followed when he launched his new airline, Virgin Atlantic, back in 1984. Now, launching an airline is a really risky, really expensive investment, and it looks like a one-way door. It looks like an irreversible decision. But Branson took what looked like a one-way door and converted it to a two-way door. He negotiated a deal with Boeing that allowed him to return the first plane that he bought if his new airline didn't take off, if he didn't like what he saw. So the next time you're making a decision, ask yourself, is this a one-way door or a two-way door? If it's a two-way door, if you can just go back, if you can reverse a decision, then it makes sense to move quickly. If it looks like a one-way door, ask yourself if you can do what Branson did and figure out a way to make this seemingly irreversible decision converted to a reversible one. And running small-scale experiments is a great way of taking what seems like an irreversible decision and making it into a two-way door. So a great example of this, the Starwood hotel chain in the United States, one of the things that they would do is when they had a new idea for something that they wanted to try, instead of rolling it out in all of their hotels, they would try in like 3 or 4 select hotels first. These were hotels in big locations with lots of people coming in, and they would just try them out just to see in these 3 or 4 hotels how that experiment worked. Now, if it didn't work, if it didn't resonate with the people who were coming into their hotels, then they abandoned it. And the damage was contained because they're trying it, right? They're just running an experiment with a small subset of their customers. And if it worked, then they could roll it out to their entire hotel chain. So that's a great way of lowering the threshold to getting started, reducing risks, and you're also getting invaluable data in the process as well when you run these small experiments to be able to figure out what's not going to work and what is going to work. Now, not every experiment is going to work. Some of these experiments are going to fail. So I'm going to spend a few minutes here talking about learning from failure, because the goal here is to, with each failed experiment, with each successful experiment, to learn, to iterate, and improve over time. Now, our aversion to failure, our fear of failure is natural, because centuries ago, failure meant getting eaten alive by this guy you're seeing here, the saber-toothed tiger. Our ancestors who were not afraid of failure didn't live long enough to pass their genes on to us. Society conditions the fear of failure. Now, growing up, failure gets us into the principal's office. Failure means getting grounded or getting our allowance cut. Failure means not getting the job that we want. But now we're told to celebrate failure. The fail fast, fail often, fail forward mantra is all the rage these days in Silicon Valley. Countless business books instruct entrepreneurs not just to embrace, but to celebrate failure. There are now conferences like FailCon, which you're seeing a photo of here, dedicated to celebrating failure. Silicon Valley companies are holding funerals for failed startups. They're basically giant parties with bagpipes and DJs spinning records. And I don't buy it. And I don't buy it for 2 reasons. Number one, when you celebrate anything, and this includes failure, you don't learn from it. And number 2, regardless of what Silicon Valley is telling us about celebrating failure, failure sucks. Whoever says they celebrate failure and they don't mind failing is lying to you. I personally failed more times than I care to remember in my life, and every single time it sucked because there's a value judgment attached to failure. Right? Failure is bad, success is good. But that fear of failure can also be paralyzing. It can be just as dangerous to celebrate failure as it is to demonize it, as opposed to as much as to demonize it. Because behind every canvas unpainted, every goal unattempted, every business unlaunched, every song unsung is the looming fear of failure. Fear of failure often gets in the way of progress because we're afraid of what might happen if this new thing that we thought about doing doesn't work. Now, we often speak of failures as losses, right? We say, well, I lost, 3 months of my life working on that project. We lost money in that failed project. But they were losses only if you call them that. Another way to frame them is as an investment. And especially if you're running these small scale experiments, if you're placing small bets, failure is going to give you really valuable data. It's an opportunity to learn, and it's going to give you information that you can't get from any book. And your goal should be to discover that information before your competitors do. Netflix is a great example of a company that sees failure as an investment. They produce a ton of original content because even the shows that don't work as well give the company data about what viewers like and what they don't like. They can then take that data to create a blockbuster. Now, if you're trying to achieve something transformative, you're not going to succeed on the first try. Einstein's first 7 proofs for E=mc² failed. SpaceX's first 3 launches were complete failures. Rockets crashed in all 3 launches. Thomas Edison famously said, "I haven't failed. I just found 10,000 ways that won't work." This is Sarah Blakely. She is the founder of Spanx, which is a fashion company in the US. She went from selling fax machines door to door to becoming the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. And she credits her success in part to a question that her father would ask her regularly when she was growing up. So her father would ask Sarah, "What did you fail at recently, and what did you learn from it?" And if Sarah didn't have an answer, her father would be disappointed. And to him, failing to try was far more disappointing than failure itself. And in asking his children what they failed at on a regular basis, Sarah's father gave them the breathing room to tackle interesting problems and, to fail from time to time. And just to be clear here, when I talk about learning from failure, I'm not referring to sloppy failures here, right? Sloppy failures are repeatedly making the same mistake over and over again, or failing because you just didn't care. Talking about intelligent failures. Intelligent failures happen when you're exploring new things, when you're building things that haven't been built before, when you're trying things that you haven't tried before. In those cases, those intelligent failures, they have to be accepted. And people should be held accountable not for failing intelligently, but for failing to learn from it. Hence the review question, what have you failed at recently, and what did you learn from it? I'm going to move on to my concluding remarks in just a moment here. I did want to mention there's additional bonuses you can get for free completely by going to this website, ozanmoral.com/keynote. You'll also get my weekly email, which shares one big idea that you can read in 3 minutes or less, along with a workbook, completely free, with additional exercises and challenges that you can apply to reinforce some of the concepts that I covered. I'm also available for doing live, in-person, and virtual events. I know there are a lot of meeting planners in the audience, so if you're interested in that, you can head over to that other website, which is bookozan.com. The final stage in the Moonshot process is achieve. Now, traditionally, achieve means getting exactly what you aim for. But here's the amazing thing about Moonshot thinking. Even if you don't get what you're aiming for, in other words, even if you fail, you actually will not fail, because your failure will take you far ahead of where you otherwise would have ended up. I didn't get my moonshot of becoming an astronaut, at least not yet. We'll see what happens. But I got to work on one of the most successful interplanetary missions of all time. And if I wasn't aiming high, if I wasn't applying moonshot thinking, I never would have gotten there. And even if you do achieve, the journey doesn't end. It's time to go back to the beginning, to reimagine, experiment, accelerate, and achieve in one continuous loop. There's a scene at the beginning of the movie Apollo 13, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. Jim Lovell, who's played by Tom Hanks in the movie, he watches with admiration as Neil Armstrong walks down the ladder and steps onto the lunar surface for the first time. And Tom Hanks looks at the monitor, the TV, and he says, you know, it's not a miracle. We just decided to go. It's not a miracle. We just decided to go. Breakthroughs are reasonable only in hindsight. The day before a major breakthrough is just a crazy idea. But if we restrict ourselves to what's possible given what we have, we'll never reach escape velocity and create a future worth getting excited about. Because in the end, all moonshots are miracles until you decide to go. All right, Miriam, I'm gonna invite you back for the Q&A section. I'm gonna stop sharing here.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Ozan, that was inspirational. You are a true original. I think these accolades that have come in from all over the world, from your books and your presentations and your lectures, are truly deserved. I know I've learned loads. We've just been chatting behind the scenes about how informative and inspiring that was. And you know what? I just want to ask anybody who is watching this live, perhaps just put an idea of your personal moonshot into that Q&A box. I know it's not really a chat function, but we'll still see it on the back end. So if you've got a moonshot, an idea, a big, audacious goal, pop it in so we can have a little look at what you're up to. And I'm going to kick off the Q&A by asking you, Ozan. So, you know, you've had this moonshot goal of being an astronaut. You've obviously pivoted. Life's a bit different now. Outside of that, what's your current moonshot goal?
I think my moonshot has now become enabling other people's moonshots. You know, it's been so fun. My book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist, came out in April of last year. In the middle of the pandemic, so I had to do a bunch of pivots to try to get the word out virtually, as opposed to doing an in-person book tour. And since then, it's just been so great to take the ideas from the book and speak about those ideas in front of different audiences and write about them on my own website. And so sort of pivoted from saying, all right, like this was my moonshot. I now want to help other people achieve their moonshots. And I do that through, you know, various different ways, of course, but speaking is a big part of it. And so that is my current moonshot. That's at the top of my list. And within that, of course, there are various different things I do. I just started working on a new book. Won't come out until early 2023, but that's definitely one of my near-term objectives as well. But it all now falls under the same umbrella of just helping others achieve their moonshots.
And what an incredible goal that is, and it's definitely been imparted, and you're doing a great job at that today. I think we'd all agree. So today we have an audience of exhibitors, meeting planners, conference organizers, associations, all within this incredible event industry. You mentioned some testing with a hotel chain. You mentioned a meeting planner might maybe want to have the goal of just producing the best meeting. But where should we all start? If we've been limited by some of our thinking and our assumptions, what's a good first next step that we can all go away and do right now?
Yeah, for sure. I think, honestly, running, and I'm surprised at how little experimentation exists in most businesses. Like when we have an idea, we think it's just going to take all of this time and effort to not only to create, but then to roll out to our entire customer base. But if you're able to just, like, say with a meeting planner, you have an idea for running a meeting differently. If you can experiment with that using, say, 5 people, right? So pick 5 people who might be representative of the type of audience that you serve, and just run this idea by them. Try it out in front of them. You know, invite them to a 1-hour-long virtual meeting and say, this is an experiment. We're just going to test this out. test this new format, this new way of moderation, this new way of facilitation, and just get feedback from them. Make sure the people that you invite into the room are representative of the type of audience that you're going to get, just so you get good data, because what works for one person may not work for the other. But really, I think just getting into that mindset of because that really reduces the intimidation. You're just saying to yourself, this is just an experiment. We're just going to try a small scale thing, see how it goes. If it doesn't go well, fine. If it does go well, we can take that and learn from the participants who are invited to this thing and iterate and improve over time.
So I guess that triggers another question for me, which is, to get to that point, somebody may be in a larger organization, maybe a couple of steps down from the senior decision makers, or who maybe doesn't feel totally empowered. How do you get that buy-in, that allyship, as it were, for these tests, these experimentations, for trying something new? How would we go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a very difficult one to answer, because you're right. In many big organizations, especially if you're not in a leadership position and the leadership is not open to moonshot thinking, to reimagining what's possible, to experimentation, they may not be fully on board at first, at least. So my advice would be, and this is what I've done personally in the organizations that I've been a part of, is to just start with yourself. So you don't have to get anybody's permission. If you have an idea on something that you're working on, start running some experiments and see how they go. And what happens even in big organizations, at least healthy ones, is if what you're doing is working well, it's going to spread to other people. It's going to spread to other people in your company. The leadership is going to take notice. And then that's how the ideas are going to spread. And I'll give you an example from, and this is a recent one within the past 2 years. One of the things that I do is I'm a professor. I've been one for the past 12 years. And I always experiment with innovative teaching methods in the classroom. Now, if I went to my fellow colleagues and I told them, this is what you have to do, right? Like, this is now the way that we should be teaching, they're going to resist and they're going to reject and say, no, like, I've been teaching this way for the past 20 years. I'm not going to change. But when I run these experiments, and some of these experiments succeed, what happens is the students start talking about them. So the students start talking on campus to other students, other faculty members hear from the students what I've been trying and what's working in my classroom, and then they start coming to me and asking me. Now they have buy-in because they've heard from students how great this innovative method is. So they come to me and ask for my own advice. And I think that mindset applies in a large organization as well. If what you're doing is working, if this experimentation mindset is helping you move closer to your goal, creating a better goal, moving to it faster than you otherwise may have done, other people are going to take notice and they're going to come to you and ask, what are you doing differently and what can we learn from you?
That idea about success breeding success, and you create your fan base, don't you? And then the word spreads, which is awesome. One quick 30-second answer for me, please, Ozan, on this final question that we're going to have, which is, if you have a load of ideas and options, do you have an evaluation framework? How do you select the one to go with, to run with, to try?
That's a great question. It's a nice problem to have. Most people have the opposite. They don't have enough ideas. If you have lots of ideas and you don't know where to start, a great way to filter some of those ideas is to bring other people into the discussion. So, these might be your colleagues at work. They might be a significant other. Run the ideas by them, see what they think. And even better, run the ideas by the people that you're going to serve. So again, if you're a meeting planner, and you have an idea for a meeting, you have lots of ideas for a meeting, invite 10 people from your target audience, so the people who are going to be attending these events, and run it by them and see what they think. Buy them lunch, buy them coffee, give them something, but bring them on board. And that way they will give you feedback before you even start experimenting.
Great, wise words. It just leaves me to say, I believe in Turkish Teşekkür ederim. Is that right for thank you?
Perfect. Yeah, bir şey değil.
Ozan Verol, that's been inspiring, insightful. I encourage every single person watching this, every single one of us to go after that moonshot goal, that new idea, that experiment that can help us drive our amazing industry forwards into this bright new future. Thank you once again, Ozan.
Thank you.